Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think I'm acquainted with most of you already, but in case not, my name is Moshe Kurtz. I work as the assistant rabbi here at Ghetto Shalom. And today we are privileged to hear from Dr. David I. Bernstein, who will be giving us a very fascinating virtual tour of the Jewish quarter in Krakow. Before we begin, just so we can appreciate who we're learning from, Dr. Bernstein is the Dean Emeritus of Pardes. He holds a BA and MA in History and a PhD in Religious Education from New York University, and also previously attended Yeshiva Hamitzvah. David has been the Dean of Pardes. There we go. David has been the Dean of Pardes since 1998. Previously, he was the director of Midreshet Lindenbaum, popularly known as Bravenders, for 12 years. David was a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mendel School for Jewish Education, Jerusalem from 1996 to 1998. And he takes many adult and student groups on Jewish heritage trips to Poland, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin. And God willing, we'll get a chance to do such tours in person. But for now, we will enjoy ourselves and suffice with a virtual presentation. So without any further ado, David, I'll make you the host and spotlight you. Oh, there you are.
Terrific.
I'll make you the host momentarily, and then you'll take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Kurtz.
There you are.
Okay. Okay. So can everybody see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, so now, so first of all, I want to welcome everybody. I see familiar names and new names, and I would like to, let's see, I'll put this over here. Good. Okay, great. And I'd like to dedicate the learning that we're doing to the memory of my grandparents, whom I never met, who were murdered by the Germans in the Shoah. Krakow, Jewish Krakow. If you visit Krakow today, as some of you did with me a few years ago with the Agudat Shalom tour, so it looks something like this. It's the Lower East Side, quote unquote, of Krakow. It was the heart of Jewish Krakow. And the older buildings have mostly been renovated now. It's actually become a place with numerous Jewish-style restaurants, and you can see here Hebrew lettering, Beit Cafe Yehudit, Misada, a restaurant called Ariel. You can find there cholent, gefilte fish, all of the Jewish delicacies, none of which are kosher, klezmer music. It's a whole sugya, it's a whole chapter to deal with what interests the Poles in this. It's not only for tourists, it's actually the coolest, hippest place to be in Krakow. It's where you would take a date on a Saturday night. And what used to be a slum during the communist era has become really a very hip part of Krakow. And the area is called Kazimierz, named for Casimir the Great. The Jews of Krakow go back probably about 1,000 years. Certainly we have evidence that they were, written evidence, they were there in the 1300s. They originally were in Krakow, but they were expelled to the other side of the river, the Vistula River, to the area of Kazimierz, which became the center of Jewish life and ultimately was absorbed into the larger city of Krakow in the late 1800s. And here's a picture of Shiroka Street before the war, when there were 65,000 Jews living in Krakow. The Jews called it Kryke. They were 25% of the population, a quarter of the population, more or less what the percentage of Jews in New York were before the flight to the suburbs. So an intensely Jewish area. And also, with some exceptions of well-to-do Jews, most of the Jews were poor. This is the Alte Shul, the oldest shul in Poland. dates from the late 1400s. And you'll notice that it is built in a fortress style. It's actually built into the wall, the defensive wall of Kazimierz. If you can follow, you can see to the left, you see the white stones. That's part of the defensive wall of the city. It extends to the far side of this brick edifice, which is part of the shul. This is a picture of the interior of the shul, the second oldest shul in Europe. The only shul older than this is the Altneu Shul in Prague. And you can see that the bima is actually the central focus of the architecture of the shul. The Aron Kodesh is kind of like second fiddle to the bima, which is different than most of our shuls today, but was typical in the medieval, late medieval, and early modern periods in terms of shul architecture. Today, it's a museum dedicated to explaining something about basic Jewish life to people who don't know very much about Jewish life. It's not used as a shul anymore. And here we could see the Ramashul, the second shul built in Krakow, in Kazimierz, the Jewish neighborhood of Krakow. And you see it says Beit HaKnesset Chadash. It's a little bit funny to call it a new shul when it was built in the mid-1500s, 1553. It was built by the Ramah's father, who was a wealthy merchant and a leader in the Jewish community. This shul is sometimes used for minyanim. And let's go inside for a moment. You can see Beit HaKnesset Chadash, de Ramah. Here again, you can see that the bima is actually the central architectural feature of the shul, rather than the Aron Kodesh. There is, you can't see it, but to the right of the bima is the amud, where the Shliach Tzibor, the Chazan, would stand, and there's a tile missing there in order to fulfill the biblical verse, Mima Makim Kraticha Hashem, from the depths I called out to you, God. And that was a convention in older shuls for the Shliach Tzibor to daven from a lower place. You can see the Ner Tamid, which is dedicated to the memory of the Ramah. As I said, the Ramah's father built this shul for him, and it served as the Ramah's not only family shul, but also his yeshiva. It's quite a small shul, and in truth, yeshivot were very small in those days. Here you could see the newly renovated ceiling. This shul, like the other shuls in Krakow, was used as a warehouse during the war, and therefore served as a use for the Germans and was not destroyed. But it fell into disrepair, and ultimately the fire brigade was occupying the shul. Finally, in the later 1950s, the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, and the city of Krakow decided to restore the shul. This is a more recent restoration that was only completed a couple of years ago, right before COVID. And here you could see another picture from the bima, a beautiful ceiling that's been redone. Right next to the shul is what's called the Ramah Cemetery. The cemetery actually preceded the shul. It was built in 1551. And the cemetery was actually desecrated by the Germans. You can see the wall in the background, the wall pieces of matzevot that were collected after the war and put into a place of honor. A lot of the matzevot were destroyed. You see this one is damaged. These metal pieces on top of the matzevot are there to try to preserve what can be preserved from the rain and from the elements, snow. It's hard to make out some of the lettering on some of the matzevot because it's quite an old cemetery. just to give us a sense of things, the Ramashul and the Ramah Cemetery were in existence more than 200 years before the American Revolution. So Jews were davening in that shul and Jews were being buried here 2 centuries before the American Revolution, just to give us a little bit of a sense of how old and I think sacred these places are. This is the matzeva of the Ramah of Moshe Isserles, who died in 1572 at the very tender age of 42. I think most of you probably know the Ramah, the greatest of Ashkenazi poskim in his time, writes the famous Ashkenazi addenda / commentary on Rav Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. In truth, he became a dayan in Krakow at a very young age. He was about 20 years old when he became a dayan in one of the most important Jewish communities in all of Europe, which just reflected his genius. He was known to take into account in his halachic decisions hefseid merubah, that is extreme loss of funds. He was very much involved with his community, and the Ramah's psak, his halachic decisions, remain today a very important part of Ashkenazic Jewish life. And on the matzeva, I won't read the whole thing. It says, "Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo haya od ki Moshe." Something we usually say about the Rambam, Maimonides. From Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, who took us out of Egypt, until Moshe, the Ramah, there was no other Moses like him. He died on Lag BaOmer, and that became a pilgrimage site, just as the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai in Israel, his yard site is also Lag BaOmer. This was a pilgrimage site for Polish Jews for centuries. It brings us to the matzeva of the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis. Rav Yoel Sirkis lives in the 17th century. He dies in 1640, about 70 years after the Ramah. The Bach is known in particular for his commentary, the Bayit Chadash, hence Bach, Bet Chet, on the tour of Rav Yosef Karo. He liked the Maharshal and like the Maharal after him were after the Maharshal. The Maharal died in 1609, was opposed to the Shulchan Aruch. They believed it was not a useful tool, that it would limit rabbinic independence in psak and halachic decisions. Once these things are in writing, they're hard to ignore. And he was known for being strict in his younger years and more lenient in his older years. In his older years, he said, let those who want to be strict for themselves and not for others. And therefore, for example, he allowed women to wear men's clothing if it was extremely cold. He allowed people sensitive to the cold not to eat in the sukkah. And also had this notion of hefseid merubah being a very important factor in halachic decisions, meaning if people were going to be losing a lot of money, the halacha has to take that into consideration. Not far from him, and again, part of this golden age of Polish Jewry, the 1500s and 1600s, is the matzeva of the Tosfot Yom Tov, of Yom Tov Lipman Heller, who succeeds the Bach as the rabbi in Krakow. And again, Krakow being one of the leading Jewish communities in Europe. The Tosfot Yom Tov was also the rabbi in Vienna and in Prague. He was known for his care for the poor. He actually lost his position in Prague because he wanted the tax burden to fall mostly on the wealthy, and the wealthy Balabatim actually drove him out of town. Hence, he came to Krakow. He was a student of the Maharal of Prague. He was also a great Talmid Chacham, and is given the name Tosfot Yom Tov because he wrote a very important commentary on the Mishnah. Today, many people learning Mishnah use the commentary of Rav Pinchas Kahati. Pinchas Kahati lived in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century here in Israel. I think he worked in a bank, but was a great Talmid Chacham. But before that, the typical edition of the Mishnah had two commentaries, Rav Ovadia Mibar Tanura and the Tosfot Yom Tov. And the Tosfot Yom Tov also wrote a very special tefillah, very special prayer that is said in many places on Shabbat mornings. It doesn't appear in most of the Sidurim that many of us use, not in Art Scroll and not in Koran, and not in Minat Yisrael, but in many other editions of the Sidur, you'll find it until today. And if you can read with me, may the one who blessed our ancestors, I'm skipping down, bless all who guard their mouths and tongues and do not speak during the time of prayer. It's a special mishaberach, special blessing for all of those people who don't talk in shul. And he asks that Hashem should shield them from all trouble and misfortune, from plague and illness. And of course, all of this teaches us that talking in shul was a problem back in the 1600s, even in Krakow. As we continue our walking tour of Kazimierz, of the heart of Jewish Krakow, we come to the Isaac Shul, also built in the 1600s. This was a much larger shul, as you can probably see. It was built very lavishly with silver chandeliers, with beautiful tapestries on the walls. Construction was actually held up by a parish priest for a number of years, but ultimately was completed. And the Isaac Shul today is under renovation. It's a beautiful place to daven. Until the renovation started, it was the main shul being used by the small Krakow Jewish community today. And here's a picture of the inside of the Isaac Shul. You can see it's done in the Baroque style, very elaborate. And again, you have to imagine the silver chandeliers and the tapestries, the elaborate tapestries on the walls. You could see the windows are in the Baroque style, and they're very large and very high. And even if the lights aren't on during the daytime, you don't need electricity, which was, of course, very important before the invention of electricity, because people would have to read the tefillot by candlelight. So this was a very important architectural innovation that was made. Here, the bima is of recent vintage, post-communist, and so we really don't know what the bima looked like at the time, but you can see the Aron Kodesh in the distance. And we continue on our walk in Kazimierz. We come to a different kind of shul. This is the temple, and you could probably tell by the name that it's a different kind of shul. The temple was built in the 1860s by a group of Jews in Krakow who called themselves the Association of Progressive Jews in Krakow. It's the closest thing we have to reform in Poland. There was no reform movement in Poland, but actually closer to what the Hungarians call neological Judaism, which is not reform. It was built by well-to-do Jews. Because of the emancipation, Jews are now allowed to live anywhere in Krakow. Many of them would come to the temple in carriages and later in automobiles. Yet they wanted to come to shul. And they wanted a shul that was a little bit more modern. So some of the innovations of the temple, which were radical for its time in Krakow, were, first of all, that the rabbi gave the sermon in the vernacular, not in Yiddish, but rather in German, because it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when Poland regained its independence in 1918, the sermon was given in Polish. That was an innovation. That didn't exist elsewhere in the shuls of Krakow. They basically kept the liturgy as is, unlike the Reform movement. It was a very Zionist temple. The rabbi for the longest period of time was Rabbi Tahon, who was a member of the Polish parliament, the Sejm, and a leader of the General Zionists. There's actually a street named after him here in Yerushalayim, in Kiryat HaYovel, Rehov Tahon. They had a mixed choir of men and women. They had an organ, but the organ only played before Shabbat, not on Shabbat itself. The temple is a very elaborate and beautiful shul, and here you could see it after its restoration. I remember in the early 1990s, it was still one mass of gray, and here you could see how colorful it is. It's done in the Moorish style, which was actually quite popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s in many shuls in the United States and in Europe. If you know the shul in Florence, Italy, it's in the Moorish style. Central Synagogue in Manhattan was built in the Moorish style. We continue our walk in Kazimierz, the Jewish heart of Krakow, and we pass by a building that today is an apartment building, but the sign tells us that it was once something else. Chet Kuf Chevra Kadisha Koveitim LaTorah, a group of Jews who got themselves together and learned. They learned Torah. This place was a Beit Midrash that was open to the public and open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Maybe not on Tisha B'Av, actually, when Torah learning is prohibited, but otherwise open all the time. And here a Jew would come in and have a cup of tea and sit with a chavruta or on his own or in a small class and learn. We usually think of the term Chevra Kadisha as referring to a burial society. That's true. But there were many Chevrot Kadisha. There was a Chevra Kadisha Omrei Tehillim, people who got together to say Tehillim together, to say Psalms together. And this one was Koveya Itim LaTorah. There were others that were Lomdei Mishnayot, learning Mishnayot together. So this is, again, part of what was a very vibrant Jewish community and a community of learning. You can see the two signs. You can see the old one that's fading and very hard to read. They put up a new one so that we would, on the one hand, not take down the old one, on the other hand, be able to read the new one. The two Maginei David tell us it was built in 1810. It was renovated in 1912. Koveya Itim LaTorah, a base medrash. Sarah Schneerer. Sarah Schneerer is a resident of Krakow. And as you can see her dates, who had a passion for Torah study and loved to learn. She was very distressed at the fact that many young women in her age in Krakow in the late 1800s and the early 1900s were moving away from Jewish religious observance. While their brothers might be learning in yeshiva, the women would go to a secular school and would absorb the general culture and begin to look down on their brothers who were quote unquote primitive and superstitious and didn't have a secular education. She was poor, she was a seamstress. She used to say how tragic it is that people seem to care more about their clothing, their exterior, than their interior, their spiritual growth. And so she began a revolution in the Haredi world in Poland. She fled to Vienna during World War I, when Krakow and Galicia were battlefields. And so she fled to Vienna, like many people did. My four grandparents fled to Vienna as well. And there she encountered something she had never encountered before. Neo-Orthodoxy, what we call modern Orthodoxy, following the teachings of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch of Frankfurt in Germany. There were schools for women. There were religious Jewish schools for women. She came back to Poland and introduced that to the Haredi community. There were already religious schools for women. There was one in Warsaw, the Chavatzelet school. But there were no real schools, religious Jewish schools for Haredi women. And this is her greatness. She's really a pioneer. She came from a family of Belzer Hasidim. And she brought her request to the Belzer Rebbe. Of course, she couldn't bring it. She came with her brother, and her brother told the Rebbe something very vague. He said, my sister wants to lead young Jewish women in the way of Torah. And the Belzer Rebbe said, bracha v'hatzlacha, not knowing she wanted to establish schools. In fact, when Beis Yaakov was established in Poland, the Belzer Hasidim initially refused to send their daughters there. But that was enough for her. She went ahead, even though many of the other Gedolim of the time were opposed to her. She went ahead with her plan. And nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. She stepped into a vacuum, and the Beis Yaakov movement spread very quickly. It eventually got the support of the Ger Rebbe and of the Chafetz Chaim, the two most important Jewish leaders in Haredi Poland in the early 20th century. And with the help of Agudat Yisrael, that came belatedly, the movement spread very quickly throughout Poland, so that there were tens of thousands of Beis Yaakov students within a decade in Poland. And then the movement spread beyond Poland, of course, to the rest of Europe, to the United States, to what was then Palestine. Here we can see in Krakow, the teacher seminary. Initially, she imported teachers from the neo-Orthodox community in Vienna and from Germany. But as the movement spread, they needed to train more and more teachers. And this was the teacher seminary that she established in the interwar years in Krakow, right along the Vistula River. Today, it's no longer used for that purpose. Here is a picture of Beis Yaakov students. By the way, many of the Beis Yaakovs were not full-day schools, but were often afternoon schools. And only some of them were full-day schools. September 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. Very quickly conquers Western Poland, where Krakow was located. And the Jews of Krakow come under the Nazi terror. Krakow becomes the capital of Nazi-occupied Poland, called the General Government. Dr. Hans Frank is the person in charge of this General Government of Nazi-occupied Poland. And he initially tries to drive the Jews out. Of the 65,000 Jews, most of them are expelled to neighboring towns or to Eastern Poland. Lublin, for example, Ishbitz were places where many of the Krakow Jews fled to or were expelled to. In March 1941, a ghetto was established. There were only 17,000 Jews left out of the 65,000 in September 1939. They were put into a very small area, which was very crowded. And here we could see Jewish slave laborers building the wall around the Krakow Ghetto. I think I don't have to tell you what the conditions in the ghetto were like: overcrowded, starvation, disease, random shootings, slave labor. This is a picture of a remnant of the Ghetto Wall today. There are a couple of remnants of the Ghetto Wall that were preserved for posterity to tell the story of what happened here. During the period of the ghetto, there was a pharmacy that was right on the border between the rest of Krakow and between the ghetto area. And that pharmacy was run by a Polish righteous Gentile named Tadeusz Pinkiewicz. um, who worked tirelessly to bring medicines and food into the ghetto, to smuggle Jews out of the ghetto, to help the resistance that was organized. Yad Vashem recognized him as a righteous Gentile for his efforts. He also simply brought news of what was going on the outside to the ghetto residents. And you can see the sign, the street sign here. It's the pharmacy is located on a plaza, an empty plaza, which we'll see in a moment, and it's called Ghetto Heroes Plaza, in memory of the Jews who were imprisoned in the Krakow Ghetto. Tadeusz Pinkevich. While Jews were in the ghetto, some of them were able to work outside the ghetto. And the most famous location was the factory of Oskar Schindler. I'm sure that most of you have seen the film Schindler's List. What you can see here is pictures of the Jews who were saved by Oskar Schindler. He comes to Krakow as a member of the Nazi Party, interested in becoming a war profiteer to make his fortune filling army orders for pots and pans. And he succeeds. He becomes extremely wealthy. He is pretty much a lowlife. He's somebody who is a womanizer, a gambler. He fails at his marriage. After the war, he'll fail at a number of businesses. But we learn from our sages, from Chazal, Adam konet olamo b'sha'a achat. A person can gain his world, maybe his world to come, in 1 hour, in one moment. And this was the case of Oskar Schindler, who becomes attached to his Jewish workers, becomes alienated from Nazi ideology, and ultimately spends his entire fortune to save about 1,000 Jews. Truly a remarkable story. It took a while for him to be recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. It was only in the mid or late 50s that he was recognized, due to the pressure of all the Jews he saved, because he was a member of the Nazi Party and a war profiteer. But it was at Sha'a Achat, that moment, where he begins to spend his fortune to save Jews, that for which he is remembered. He's buried here in Yerushalayim in the Mount Zion Cemetery, the Christian cemetery, of course. And I've had the privilege of being in Poland with descendants of Schindler Jews. There's a picture of Oskar Schindler. There was another Schindler in Krakow and in Tarnów named Julius Madrich, who also had a factory. And like Oskar Schindler, Madrich also decides that he's going to spend his fortune that he made during the war to save his Jewish workers. And he saved a few hundred Jewish workers. He's also recognized as a righteous Gentile by Yad Vashem. This is the plaza that was next to the pharmacy. The pharmacy is actually located right over here. And it was in this plaza that the remaining Jews of the 17,000 in Krakow were gathered in March of 1943, when the ghetto was very brutally and violently liquidated by the Germans. Many of them were sent to Belzec during the ghetto period. Of those who remained, when they were gathered here in this plaza in March 1943, many were shot in the liquidation of the ghetto. And those who survived, most of them were sent to Plaszów, the nearby concentration camp that again is featured in Schindler's List movie. And what you can see here are empty chairs. This is a memorial trying to tell us that people are missing. People are missing really what was once a quarter of the population of the city. has now been reduced to a very, very small number. We don't even know how many Jews live in Krakow, but it's a small number. That's the pharmacy again. This is a shul called the Zucker Shul. The ghetto was located not in Kazimierz, in the heart of Jewish Krakow, but the Nazis used a slum area called Podgorza as the ghetto. There were 4 shuls that were there from before the war. The Nazis did not allow them to be used as shuls during the war. They were turned into warehouses like the other shuls of Krakow. After the war, this shul was built in around 1880. After the war, the shul fell into disrepair. The ceiling collapsed. But in 1996, again after the fall of communism, it was renovated. The facade that you can see here, the brick facade, was restored, and inside today there's an art gallery. Zucker Shul. And that brings us to something that opened up in 2008, again after the fall of communism, the JCC in Krakow. You might wonder what's a Jewish community center doing in Krakow, and there's really a very beautiful story to it. I have to say, the first time I saw this building, I came to Poland, I saw a JCC, I just didn't believe it. What's it doing there? And the story is that Prince Charles of England came to visit Auschwitz. Krakow is the nearest city to Auschwitz. So after his visit, he came to Krakow and he asked if he could meet with Holocaust survivors. This was around the early 2000s. And he met with some survivors and he said to them, "What can I do for you?" The kind of thing only a prince can offer. And they said, "We're not religious. We don't go to temple. We don't go to synagogue. We'd like a place to meet, to get together." Prince Charles took the idea back with him to England. He met with leaders of British Jewry, and they began to talk about a plan that would go beyond what the survivors requested. Yes, there would be a place for them to meet, but there would also be a Jewish community center that would service not only the survivors, but other Jews in Krakow who were at this time coming out of the woodwork. With the fall of communism, many people found out about their Jewish roots, sometimes by accident, sometimes on the deathbed of a grandparent. They found out that they were Jewish. And it was to service this newly found out Jewish community, as well as the survivors, that the JCC was opened. And here you can see the JCC. It's actually right next to the temple that we saw before, in the heart of Kazimierz, the Jewish center of Krakow. And here we can see the first Jewish preschool to open in Krakow since the 1940s, which opened in the JCC only a couple of years ago. And here we can see the JCC Passover Seder, an online Seder, in addition to in person. But this was during COVID. How do I make it? How do I make a Seder, a Pesach Seder? Just one of the many, many activities that the JCC has. They have actually Hebrew and Yiddish language classes. They have 300 people studying Hebrew. By the way, the majority of them are not Jewish. Such is the interest in Jewish things in Poland today. And today, this JCC is actually, I was just there in right before Pesach with a group of students from MMY. And we came there and we heard from the director, Jonathan Ornstein. We heard from Rabbi Avi Baumel. an American who made Aliyah, spends half of his time in Krakow. And we saw that it's been turned into a distribution center for Ukrainian refugees. That over and above the work they do with survivors and the preschool and the small Jewish community in Krakow, it is now also a distribution center of food, of pharmaceutical needs, clothing, baby carriages. We came in the evening when the distribution center was closed. But the next morning, I took the MMY students on a walking tour. We've done it virtually, on a walking tour of Kazimierz. And there's a line outside this building in the early morning hours of people waiting to come in order to get baby wipes for their children. They're almost all women and children, because the men are not allowed to leave the Ukraine if they're of between, I think, 18 and 50 or 60. So it's almost all women and children. And they're picking up baby carriages and car seats and baby wipes and diapers, and all sorts of things. And they're waiting online. And it was quite shocking to see the line, to understand that in our day and age, people are waiting online for food or essential items. Of course, it takes us back in history, but it's also, I think, remarkably to the credit of the JCC and to the Polish Jewish community, which is hosting refugees in the Yeshivat Chochmei Lublin today. And there are other Jewish sites that are acting as distribution centers and really stepping up to the plate to help these unfortunate people, some of whom are Jewish and many of whom are not. The Jews, they help in other ways as well, in spiritual ways. So with that, we'll conclude the slide share. And let's see if I can go back. Okay. Having a little trouble here. I apologize. Okay, there we are. So with that, we come back to ourselves without the slides, and I'm open to answer questions that people might have. Veronica, please. You have to unmute yourself. Rabbi Kurtz, can we unmute? Yes.
I'm the same Veronica that was going on the trip from May 10th. I'm also in Jerusalem, but this is my shul in Stamford. So I want to take the opportunity to get a little taste of what I'm missing and hope we'll be rescheduled at some time in November or next May. I also
unless Agudat Shalom schedules a trip before that, in which case maybe you'll go with them. We'll see.
Maybe, but I'm mostly in Jerusalem now. I just got approved for Aliyah, so I'm very excited. Thank you. I just had a comment. I was watching an interview with a woman who had entered a shelter in the basement of the Jewish community or the basement of the synagogues. And in Poland and in Ukraine. And she had said, I'm not Jewish, but this is the only safe place to be. And I thought, did the irony of that ever hit anybody? I mean, in Ukraine, in the basement of a shul is the only safe place to be for a Christian. I mean, I'm glad they're taking them in. It's the right thing to do, and they should. But I thought, oh my gosh, 75 years of history, ignored, forgotten, moved on. It was just very striking.
Indeed.
And I
Natan
look forward to
Sharansky,
hearing more.
okay, Natan Sharansky recently said that when he was living in the Soviet Union, everybody had an identity card. And on the identity card, it listed your nationality. If you were Jewish, it said Ivray, Jewish. He said how ironic it is that today, if you have Ivray on your Ukrainian identity card, it's actually a benefit. It's actually an opening. You have a place to go. You have people who will care for you. Of course, you can come to Israel.
Yeah. It's a miracle to be here in Jerusalem. I must tell you that. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. Good to meet you, Veronica.
Good to meet you too again.
Anybody else have a question that they would like to ask?
Let's say everyone.
Marty raised her hand, I think.
Oh, Marty.
Yeah,
you unmute yourself?
please, Marty.
Hello. Back when you were showing the slides from the Ramashul cemetery, I just wanted to check. This is a memory check. I was in Krakow in 1998 for March of the Living, and am I correct in remembering that even though it's very ornate, the Ramah's Tombstone is actually one of the few originals. The memory serves that they actually covered a few of those stones with dirt and maybe even like trash or some other kinds of debris so that the Nazis wouldn't think to like look underneath to destroy it. And that's why it's so, you know, beautifully carved and preserved. Is my memory intact?
I'll tell you the truth, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
It looks to be in too good shape to have been original.
Mhm.
But could it have been a pre-war matzeva that was simply restored? But you know, matzevot that are 500 years old are very, very hard to read. That's not hard to read at all.
Right.
So I'm just not sure, you know, exactly when this particular matzeva is from. I know that a lot of the matzevot after the war were simply put in place that were not necessarily the correct place, but the Gedolim, the Ramah, the Tosfot Yom Tov, the Bach, the survivors knew those places, and therefore the matzevot that were made after the war were put in the correct place. Whether this one was somehow original and restored, or whether it's a newer version, I can't say for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
David, one more time, how old did you say Rama was when he died? He was pretty young.
42. 42.
Wow,
He died in
Wow.
1572.
at such
the
a
age
young
of
age,
42.
he managed so much within such a short time.
Correct. Correct.
Even though I've been with you on that whole tour, but it's every time it sounds like adds a whole lot to your knowledge. Thank you very much for you presented it. Just fantastic.
You're muted, Rabbi Kurtz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernstein, for your time. We appreciate getting the virtual tour, and as many of you mentioned, God willing, we hope to do so in person, Bimher V'yameinu.
Amen.
All right. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and God willing, we'll see you guys on other programs and Shiurim in the future. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.